Thank you, everybody. I'm very excited to be here. I heard such great things about Mobilism last year, and the day and a half or so that I've been here has been wonderful. I have a lot of material to go through, so I'm going to go very, very quickly. And if you want to follow along, I'm going to be tweeting while I talk. My Twitter handle is @Griggs. The slides are already up. You can get them at bit.ly/immobilism. And I'm very pleased to be at a conference that's entirely about mobile web so that I can talk about TVs. Which, the first question that I got asked when I came up with this topic is, why am I going to be talking about televisions? And there are a couple of very selfish reasons. It gave me an excuse to get an Apple TV. I didn't have to fight with my wife for that. The other reason was that when you go to a conference like this, it's a one-track conference where everybody's talking about mobile. It's kind of nice to have a topic that you know that nobody else is going to steal your talking points from. So you get to sit back and not have to worry about that. But the main reason I wanted to talk about it is because of something that happened to me a couple years ago. I was speaking at Google Zeitgeist, which is a conference Google puts on, and we're sitting there in the audience, and the MC for the conference says, "How many of you have heard of Google TV?" And everybody raised their hands. And then he asked how many of them had actually seen a Google TV or played with Google TV. And this was before Google TV came out, so only 4 people raised their hands. And then we had this Oprah Winfrey moment where he's like, "You get a Google TV, and you get a Google TV." And it was really awesome, because not only were we going to get a Google TV, but it happened to be a Google TV with a Blu-ray player, and my DVD player had just broken the week before. So I was really excited about it. I didn't even know what the Blu-ray player was going to be. I just knew that I didn't have to go shopping. And I didn't realize at the time that what I was going to get was this Sony Blu-ray player, the one that has the remote that everybody likes to make fun of. I think it was the day, or like maybe the day after, I figured out which actual Blu-ray player I was going to get, that my co-founder Liza went to an electronics store, saw this remote, thought it looked so atrocious, and took a photo of it and tweeted about how bad it was. I was like, oh man, that's my new Blu-ray player. I was looking forward to it. But the really, really cool thing about having a Google TV, first, despite the fact that people sort of made fun of the first generation of these televisions, there was pieces of it that I thought were really good. It was really great for a 1.0 version. And I spent a lot of time in the spotlighted apps that they had. And in particular, I spent a lot of time watching Vimeo on Google TV. I'd watched various videos on Vimeo before, but hadn't really felt engaged in sort of their staff picks channel. But on television, the video was amazing and beautiful. And I would just spend time watching video after video. And I could skip with my remote, and I would just, I would spend, 15, 20 minutes just watching random 2-minute segments and enjoying Vimeo and that experience. It was 2 months later when I realized that experience was a web page. Right? So I spent a lot of time 2 years ago, 3 years ago, talking to people about web versus native and having these conversations about how to build things that equaled native experience on mobile devices. And I had been fooled for 2 months into thinking that the Vimeo app on this was actually a native application, which got me really excited about this. I mean, what is possible with this? And you can see this on your own device. You can actually go to the Vimeo site and enter couch mode. There's a little tiny link on the page, and you'll see what the television version of Vimeo is like. And it's a really compelling experience. So it started getting me to think about what it would be like to build stuff using web technology on televisions. The second reason why I think we really need to pay attention to televisions is that if there's an upcoming zombie apocalypse of devices, the way that Scott Jensen describes it, then it's certain that TVs are going to be the next zombie. We know, for example, that Netflix, during peak times in the United States, accounts for 33% of downstream traffic. It's a big enough issue that a lot of these televisions actually have buttons on them for the remotes so that you can get directly into Netflix. Another reason why I think it's a big deal is because we know that people are using their mobile devices. They're using their tablets. 88% of people who own tablets in the United States admit to using their tablets while watching television. 86% of people who own smartphones talk about using their smartphone while watching television. So what we've got is we've got these 2 electronic devices, right? We've got the television screen and we've got the mobile device, tablet or smartphone. And there's no communication between them. The humans are actually doing all the work. right? And what actually happens when the television itself can communicate to that device and say, hey, this is the television show that's being watched. Instead of making the person go to IMDb and try to figure out who that actor is and type in the show, right, the TV should be able to tell that device. Or if you're watching a sporting event, right, what is the box score as of that moment in the sporting event? And things get really interesting when you start time-shifting television. And if you could actually have the television talk to the device and provide information about what's being watched and how far into the viewing of that it is, you can get some really interesting information. Maybe you get your Twitter stream as of that moment in time. So there's this inherent user behavior that's not supported by the technology that if it was supported by the technology, if televisions were indeed smart, I think we would see an explosion of usage, an explosion of interactions between these multiple screens. We also know, for example, that Xbox, right, that Microsoft announced a month or so ago that Xbox Live is used more for entertainment now than it is for gaming. Now, this doesn't mean that Xbox 360s are overall used more for television and entertainment than it is for gaming, because they're talking specifically about live, so multiplayer games. But as far as Xbox Live is concerned, it absolutely is more entertainment than it is for games. And then finally, we've got Steve Jobs in his autobiography talking about how he's cracked television finally. And because of this, even though they haven't released a product yet, everybody was writing about how at CES this year, the #1 product that people wanted to talk about was a product that wasn't even out yet, what Apple's television would look like. And all of the television manufacturers were doing things to try to address the problems that they would see if Apple entered the market. So they were touting all the smartphone or smart TV features and how they would address things like voice recognition and gestures and things like that. We're also seeing things that indicate that the television manufacturers are afraid of what happens when Apple gets into this space. Even though they'll say things like Samsung has done a couple of times where they talk about, hey, bring it on. There's no way that Apple will be able to compete in this area. And when I read this, I thought it was really appropriate that the Sydney Morning Herald was the newspaper that was reporting what Samsung said, because I found myself shaking my head at this comment. I mean, really, have these people not forgotten the ways in which the people who were incumbents in the smartphone industry had a sense of bravado about what they could do and what Apple could do in the space if Apple got into the smartphone industry? That was a lot of what Horace was talking about this morning. So if Apple gets into this market, I think that there's a really good chance that all of us next year will be trying to figure out how to deliver the web to these devices. That's assuming, of course, that the Apple TV, or whatever that TV is, has a browser in it, which it doesn't right now. And so one of the questions is, why would I assume that this television is going to have a browser in it? Especially when Steve Jobs himself has talked about the fact that people have computers. They don't want their television to be another computer. This is a hard one for people in the computer industry to understand, but it's really easy for consumers to understand. They get it. I mean, talk about a quote that was speaking directly to me when he said it. I was so depressed. But the thing is that Steve Jobs also said that people need keyboards and that the tablet market wasn't going to go anywhere, right? So there's a history here of Apple poo-pooing ideas that until they figure out the correct way to do it. So I think that there's a decent chance that Apple TV will have a browser in it. The main reason I think it is because the big opportunity on televisions is building a platform and building an ecosystem like we've seen on mobile. And the ability for various channels or media providers or game developers or whoever to build applications for this. We know that when it comes to iOS, and actually, I guess all the mobile platforms, that the WebOS is already here, as Luke Berluschi wrote recently. He was talking specifically about the fact that all of these major brands are using combinations of web and native technology. So you've got LinkedIn talking about how 95% of their app is built using HTML5. You've got the Facebook timeline being built in HTML5. And you even have Apple using embedded web views in their iTunes store, which you will notice if you happen to be in a hotel that's got a really poor internet connection, because you can see the page load before the CSS renders. That's really great progressive enhancement. I mean, I'm sort of joking, and I'm also serious, right? Like, they've built a page that 99% of the time you would never know that it was actually a web page. But Apple's own App Store and iTunes is embedded web views. Netflix also, being the dominant player when it comes to television video, sort of online video, talks about how their whole strategy is around HTML5. And the Apple TV, if you jailbreak it, you can install software that allows you to have a browser on it. And that browser isn't built from scratch. That browser is there because WebKit is already on the Apple TV. It's an Apple TV is iOS. WebKit is part of iOS. It's there. It's just not exposed in a way that we can use right now. So the way that I look at it is if we end up with apps on an Apple TV, we're going to have embedded web views because the apps require that. And if we're going to have embedded web views, unless Apple does something by policy to ban third-party browsers, there are going to be third-party browsers in that app store, which then means that it's very likely that Apple would want to have its own browser and define that experience. So I think it's very likely if we see apps on Apple TV, that will be the moment that it will open up for all of us to deliver stuff and build things for those devices. The second thing is if we turn and we look at Google, Eric Schmidt recently said that by the summer of 2012, this summer, that the majority of televisions you see will be powered by Google TV, which caused people to say, really? This thing? That's Schmidt crazy, right? Like, no way is that going to happen. But if you go back and you look at Q4, and you know, in Q4 sales, Sony is the only manufacturer that actually had a Google TV-based device. But in CES this year, it was announced that LG, Vizio, and Samsung all are adding Google TV support. Toshiba has already talked about the fact that they've been working on Google TV, but they don't want to be a leader in this space, which is kind of a weird thing in the first place, to announce that you don't want to be a leader. But they've announced that they're looking at Google TV, and they're going to follow the other manufacturers. And they're pretty strong indications that Sharp is also working on Google TV-based televisions. So we think that could actually be a reason why Eric Schmidt had that level of confidence. Another piece is that Google bought Motorola, right? And the main reason we tend to think about it is because Motorola had mobile patents and has the mobile division and all this sort of stuff. But Motorola Mobility, when it split from Motorola proper, had two divisions brought into Motorola Mobility. One was the mobile division. The other was set-top boxes. So now, and Motorola's set-top box division was the top-selling set-top box division in, or top-selling set-top boxes as of like the first half of 2011. So Google has this great opportunity to use Motorola's set-top boxes to actually deploy Google TV to all the cable operators. So the way that I look at it is that sort of crazy remote that I was looking at, that first generation of Google TV, might actually be the equivalent of the G1, right? They both are kind of ugly, and they have really wickedly bad keyboards. But if they're the same, then we might be looking at the same sort of explosive growth when it comes to Google TV that we're looking at Android mobile phones. And Google TV is built on Android. The final reason why I think it's really important to talk about smart TVs is that the more that we think about televisions as part of the ecosystem to which we're going to have to deliver web and content and services, it helps us understand how we need to, what sort of solutions we need, and it informs how we build stuff for mobile. And it makes sure that we don't build stuff that's short-sighted. It helps us avoid those sorts of solutions. So let's dig in a little bit on this. Let's look at what these TVs are like. First, let's start with some good news. The browsers in these TVs are actually surprisingly good. So I went in and did a bunch of testing at stores and tested a bunch of the 2011 and 2012 models. I used HTML5 test as one of the tests that I did. And what you'll notice is that the 2012 LG model has a HTML5 test of 302 with bonus points of 8. The iPhone 4S running 5.1 has a test score of 305 with bonus points of 9. Right? Very comparable. If you look at the Google TV up there, you'll see that it has a HTML5 test score of 343. It's actually a better browser than what's available on iOS. So these are very capable browsers. And Modernizer backs that up. 100% of the smartphones supported these selectors and properties, a lot of the stuff that we would need. 70% or more supported these other ones, things like local storage, app cache, things that we would find useful in delivering applications using web technology. There was poor support for other features that Modernizer looks at. I will just point out that the audio and video one actually is incorrect. I'm not sure why it came up as not supporting those, because I watched video on every one of those TVs. So something went wrong with that portion of the modernizer test. But overall, these browsers are pretty good. And more importantly, the 2012 models of these smart TVs are much faster than the 2011 models. The 2011 models would have a decent browser, but the rendering speed of the pages was really slow. So you just watch them sort of paint down the page. The 2012 models are actually pretty zippy. They load the pages pretty well. It's unfortunate that we can't really tell how fast it is, because even though they talk about dual-core processors, nobody releases the gigahertz. Nobody talks about the RAM. Nobody tells you what the specifications of these devices are. So you can't actually tell how fast one TV is relative to another. So what's it like to actually use the browser on these TVs? Well, it sucks, which is the unfortunate part. And the biggest problem is all related to input. Right? This is the challenge. How do we get information in? How do we enter in web URLs? How do we fill out forms? Do all these sorts of things? And you see televisions trying to solve it in really different and sort of terrifying ways. T9 is back. I don't know about you all, but I missed it. I really missed pressing 3 times to get to an R. This interface, I think the 90s called, and they want their anti-alias text back, or their non-anti-alias text back. This is really terrifying too, because this was I think it was a Sharp television. I can't remember. It was a 55-inch display, and it was actually a really beautiful display. Like when you're going through the menus, everything looked great and stuff. And then you get to the point where you actually need to enter in a web URL, and you get that input. Right? Like, everything else is great. You know, Scott likes to talk about the web as second-class citizens. Like, this is a great example of it. So you get this little tiny screen on this huge 55-inch display. It was terrifying. The only thing worse than that is the poor quality of the photo I took of it. So that's this problem, this input problem, is why you see remotes like this. Why you see remotes that are keyboards or remotes that are crazy like that. And it's not like Apple has solved this problem with its Apple TV. I mean, that remote, sure, is much more beautiful than the Sony remote, but it doesn't solve the input problem. Apple does do the remote app, and these apps make interacting with smart TVs bearable. So the ability to use a touchscreen to navigate, or input text, these sorts of things. And nearly every manufacturer has its own app now. Doing something very similar. Not just navigation, but also being able to launch applications and being able to modify the volume or change channels. You also see stuff like replicating the D-pad on the touchscreen, which at first I thought, wow, that's really crazy. If I've got a touchscreen, why do I want a D-pad on the touchscreen? But in reality, using a D-pad as a way to interface with the television is one of the better ways. So replicating it on a mobile device actually worked pretty well. The other thing that this sort of points out to me, and that we need to start considering, is how we're moving into this multi-screen world. So these remote applications are interacting with televisions. We've got AirPlay on iOS, where you're able to play something over on the TV, or maybe you're playing a game and you're able to control the game using your mobile phone. And I found myself wondering, as I was going through this process and I was pairing my phone to these different TVs, I'm probably paired with every TV at that video store at this point in time, what the process would be to pair a web page on that television with a web page on my phone, right? How we would make that happen. And how does the web participate in this new world? I want to talk just briefly about these 2 methods of input on these TVs, other than those linked apps. The first of which is D-pads, up, down, left, right, something like the Nintendo devices back in the 80s. You've seen this many, many times. And the second is pointers. These are much more like the Wii remote, where you just move the remote and you move a pointer across the screen, some sort of cursor. When implemented properly, the D-pad is really amazing. So this is Opera's SDK. Opera has a TV browser. It's really good. You can actually go in and test on this, and you can see how right now I'm on the Orlando, Florida version of the Breaking Development Conference, and it's got a blue outline around it. And if I press down on the D-pad, it goes down to the register link. And so I can just move through the page very quickly by going from link to link using the D-pad. When D-pads control on-screen cursors, things go downhill very quickly. Basically, you're pressing donk, 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 like trying to incrementally move that mouse up the screen. And it's really, really poor. And the sad part about it is that a lot of these televisions would have really great interfaces for using D-pad to get around the apps, but the moment you went in the browser, you got the cursor back. Really sad. The pointers work well with on-screen cursors, right? Having that arrow on the screen, but they're harder to control. One of the things that I was doing was, in order to get the sort of precision to like hit targets and hit links that were small, was I was having to hold the remote to my stomach and like so that I could steady my hand and sort of make sure that I was hitting the points that I wanted to hit. Later on, I found out that these remotes are built to be used at 10 feet away, and so you get more precision the further you are away from the TV. Now, I don't know if the instruction manuals describe that, or if there are people at home like standing close to their TV trying to figure out what's going on, and they're just watching the cursor zip around the screen. It was pretty challenging. And because of this, you see a lot of experiments, whether it's the Samsung remote where it's got numbers on the front and a keyboard on the back, or the Sony, which has been replaced by a new one that's got a touch screen and it's got a keyboard on it. It's better than the first generation. It's probably still quite as ugly. People are experimenting with voice control. LG and Samsung both have voice control remotes. There's also a Samsung TV that does gestures. They're trying to copy the Kinect. I think that both of these are attempts to copy, either Siri or copy Kinect. And from the salespeople I talked to, none of them work well. I tried to use one of the gestures ones, and I couldn't get the TV to recognize it, other than one time when I inadvertently triggered the gesture. And the gestures that I wanted to give that TV, when it wouldn't allow me to enter a /, it did not register them. So, these sorts of interfaces aren't working. But what I would say is that it seems really clear to me that with all the experimentation going on, that one of these input formats, one of these things is going to succeed down the road. And I don't know what it is. And it might take Apple to get into that space. It might be one of these TVs, or it might be Google that figures it out. But at some point, we'll reach a point where input is no longer a barrier, and then we'll have browsers on TVs that are really compelling and good. So what does it mean to build for this? And when I started reading about what it means to build for TVs, I kept coming back to instructions and things that sounded a lot like discussions of context, how building for television context was different than building for desktop or building for mobile, which is really funny because we spent the last sort of 2 years talking about how mobile doesn't have a context, how our understanding of mobile context is oftentimes wrong because we've been envisioning it as somebody running down the road with a phone in hand, and if we don't get them information quickly, they're going to run into a pole or get hit by a car or something like that. And in reality, what we know is that people use their mobile devices during downtime. They use them while waiting in lines. As we were talking about earlier, they watch TV. And this has caused people to say, really, we don't know anything about mobile context, right? And I think that goes a little too far. I would say that we actually know too much about mobile context, because we know that 39% of people use their phone while on the toilet. And when you tweet about this, people will tell you that 61% are wrong, or are lying, I'm sorry. So yes, we can't know mobile context, and that seems to be a challenge, or at least we don't yet know how to actually know what context somebody's in when they're on a mobile device. But when it comes to televisions, it seems like context actually comes back into the picture. There are a couple of sites, really great resources for how to build something for televisions. The first of which is Opera, has a great web section talking about creating web content for television. The second is Google has designing web content for TV. And both of them talk about what it means to design something for this 10-foot UI, and how different that is from designing things for phones or designing things for desktop. Some of the things they recommend are, for example, the minimum font size being much larger than it is on other devices, that line length should be 10 words or less, or 5 to 7 words in the case of Google. And you can see how addressing these and sort of modifying UI to fit that screen makes a lot of sense. The Guardian has a beta version of Google TV, and what they've got is they've got small text or large text, short lines, really easy to navigate, works really, really well. Another thing you'll notice, or at least hopefully you'll notice, is that, again, we're seeing sort of a highlight behavior. That's because that particular site supports the D-pad and this D-pad interaction model. Another thing that Google talks about is that for images or for elements on the page, that it should be 1.5 times or 2 times for 720p or 2 times for 1080p, right? This is really interesting to me as somebody who's spending a lot of time thinking about responsive images, because there were a lot of solutions early on that were copying sort of iOS conventions of 1x and 2x images when it came to Retina displays. But it's clear that we're not just going to be dealing with Retina displays. It's not going to be 1x and 2x, right? Like, we're going to be dealing with a variety of different image densities. And I also find myself wondering whether the 2x versions of these images will actually be the same images that we need for Retina that we need for televisions. They talk about optimizing for tasks. And this is one area that I think is substantially different between mobile and televisions. So they talk about, and particularly Google says, perform default tasks automatically. And what they mean by this is the fact that if you're watching a video program, for example, right? So this is NPR, National Public Radio in the United States. If you go to watch a video, or if you just launch their application, it starts playing video immediately. There's no need to press play. On iOS, Apple has intentionally removed the ability to autoplay anything. What Google says is, hey, these TVs are going to be in living rooms. They're going to be on Wi-Fi most of the time, right? And you should just assume that they're on Wi-Fi. So you should go ahead and start playing the video, right? If we made that assumption on mobile, people would kill us, right? Because they don't want to have that sort of experience. They want to choose when they're going to take that hit on their data plan. Another thing that's interesting about this is that if you leave the remote alone for a little bit, all of the UI layer goes away. It just fades out, and you're just left with the video. So all of the UI is an overlay. And for quite some time, we've been talking about how, because of touch, that hover's gone away. Well, hover's back, because that's what's happening when you move the cursor, is hover is there. And so all of a sudden, the UI comes back up. They talk about the fact that Google TV encourages that D-pad, what we were looking at with the Guardian, what we were looking at before. And so you need to design your web pages in a way that supports D-pad navigation. Fortunately, there's a CSS 3 basic navigation, or directional focus navigation spec. And it's pretty easy, right? So in CSS, you say nav down. If the focus is on the copyright element, if you do nav down, you go to the logo element. And they've got a more complex example. So if you do nav right, you go to button 2, nav left, button 4, that sort of stuff. So it seems like you could build a web page, and it would be a lot of work to do this stuff, but you could actually build a web page that would work using CSS. Unfortunately, only 2 of the 10 TVs that I tested supported this. So Google says, hey, you should use this jQuery UI library that we've built that allows you to do navigation, to be able to support D-pad navigation to move through web pages. And it's really cool. You can actually test this in Chrome. You can get to full screen mode. You can use your keyboard. Your arrows control it, and enter goes. It's a lot of fun. I really encourage you to go take a look at the libraries, because it's got a lot of examples of how things should be built for televisions. Unfortunately, I couldn't get it to work on most of the TVs that I tested on. I couldn't actually even get past that original help screen. So I need to do a little bit more testing. It could be the way that that help screen is designed. But as far as I could tell, neither one of these were universally accepted as a way to support D-pad navigation on televisions. And even if they were, both solutions require us to add a layer of CSS or JavaScript just for the television to support its navigation model. And this isn't what we do on mobile devices, right? It's nice if we add support for touch and swipe and some of these other things, but it's not necessary, right? But this actually feels necessary to have a good experience on the web on these televisions, which is troubling. There are also a bunch of performance challenges. Both Google and Opera talk about this. Google talks about the fact that it's not going to be able to render web pages as fast as your workstation. Opera talks about things like the fact that there's a low limit on caching. You can't assume that assets are going to be cached, and you can't rely on cookies for subsequent requests. I really hope that doesn't turn out to be true in future televisions, but it is for televisions of the past. Google talks about the fact that scrolling sucks on many of these TVs. I don't think they say it sucks. I think that's my interpretation, but it does, in fact, suck. And so consequently, they argue that what you should be doing is avoiding scrolling if you can. So the examples they give is this is a slider control, part of their jQuery UI library. And what happens is that as you wake your way across using the D-pad, and you hit that, you start on the upper left one, you hit the far right image, if you hit right once again, it will slide in new content, and then you can D-pad through that. You can sort of select your way through that. Each of these manufacturers talks about the fact that you're going to be supporting different resolutions. So even though Google only supports HDTV, you still have 720p and 1080p. The exact pixel dimensions of a television vary from manufacturer to manufacturer. Opera has not only dealing with standard definition TVs, but they've also got sort of legacy systems like the Wii, which has an Opera browser in it, but has a virtual width of 800 pixels, not even its true width. It's really strange. So the actual resolutions do vary quite a bit. This is the LG TV that I thought was the best of the bunch that I tested on, but I can't get rid of the Chrome. So there's no way to go full screen, and so consequently, whatever I built, if I'm trying to build a page that doesn't have scrolling behavior, I really need to test ahead of time to find out what the true resolution is. There's also issues with overscan. Google TV does a decent job of overscan is like older TVs would have molding that covered part of the screen because the television would convey information on the edges of the screen that people didn't need to see. And that would cover up to 5% of the screen's total resolution. So when you're designing stuff for television, you actually have to keep things away from the edges. James Pierce wrote this great article about how to understand screen width on mobile and how it's much more difficult than it seems like it should be. I really encourage you to read it. I didn't go to this level of length of testing because he was finding things like, depending on whether you tested before the document loaded or after the document loaded, you'd get different results. On TVs, I was just looking at pure resolution tests, and I was still seeing differences. So no problem, right? We've dealt with different resolutions in the past. What we're going to do is essentially what we've been doing for mobile. Right now, we're going from feature phones up to computers, and all we need to do is just add on the end televisions. No big deal. Except if you go to Apple's site and you look at the iMac, the low-end iMac, what you'll notice is that resolution is the exact same resolution as an HD TV. The monitor that I use every single day in my house is actually HD TV resolution. I didn't even realize it until I started doing this research. So consequently, using things like screen width in a media query to make a decision about what UI to present isn't going to work when it comes to televisions. But that's not a problem, right? We've got media types. And while we all know screen and print, there's also a media type called television. And so we can use this media type called television to deliver CSS to TVs so that we can provide the correct UIs for this. Of course, none of the TVs, not a single one of them, support the TV media type. The reason why makes a lot of sense. We've all been building websites that only provide screen, and screen is mutually exclusive. And if they supported TV, what it would mean was that they would break 99.8% of the web. So basically, other than screen and print, media types are really useless. And all this, just as an aside, makes me think that web developers are kind of litter bugs, right? We're all in this. We all do this. So we wrote a book. Liza and I wrote a book, and we used type equals screen in it. I didn't realize at the time that maybe we should have been using all, or had never really explored the implications of using all versus using screen. But all of us built web pages that use screen in our CSS, and now screen and media types are just synonymous, right? We can't actually build things using TV or handheld or any of the other media types. Because if one person throws away a cup of coffee or a cup, it's probably not a big deal. But once everybody's littering, then it becomes a big problem that somebody has to deal with. And who ends up dealing with it are the browser makers. And I think this is really why we ended up in the vendor prefix mess, right? Same sort of issue. I have an increasing level of sympathy for browser makers because of this sort of stuff. As I've been dealing with both on the TV side, learning why we can't use media type, and also on the image side, trying to understand what it would mean to create some sort of new specification, a new element that would actually be able to be used into the future and wouldn't end up somebody sat down and created media types and thought, this is really going to solve this problem for when televisions have browsers in them. And they were probably right. What they didn't anticipate was all of us, right? And so I don't know how to do this, but I feel like we need to be careful. and even people who are really seasoned professionals, people who take their craft very seriously, we're all sort of guilty of making mistakes in this regard, and I don't know ways around this, but I think that as we look at solutions and we start building things now, we need to sort of take into consideration how things will be used in the future, and hopefully we can avoid things like this. I'm excited to see that some of the conversations on vendor prefixing have gone beyond what Opera's done and actually talking about how to fix vendor prefixes down the road. Can you detect the TV with JavaScript? Nope. So all right, fine. We'll just use device detection. Everybody thinks it's evil, but sometimes we need to use it. So then the user agent string for this Samsung TV, there's not a thing in it that is unique to a television. Nothing in it that we can use. And so that really sucks, right? No CSS, no JavaScript. User agent is indistinguishable. What's the solution? I don't see a lot of people working on it. There are a handful of people working on ways to address smart TVs, but it's really early, and we need better solutions. The one thing that I take solace in is that I think that there's a possibility that smart TVs are sort of at the point in evolution that mobile was before the release of the iPhone. A lot of the things that I hear people talking about when they talk about smart TVs are very similar, right? Input is really hard. You have to think about context. Like all of these things are things that we heard before when it came to mobile. And so maybe what we need to do is just wait until Apple and Google and the other sort of big players come in and we get better interfaces, and then these problems will go away. I'm not really certain, but I think that there's a possibility that may be part of what clouds the picture right now. Regardless of what we end up doing, I think it's also clear that we'll end up using responsive design as part of that solution. I really like the way that Stephanie Rieger talks about responsiveness as a characteristic. So even if we decided that we needed to detect TVs and route them to different displays, we'd still need to use responsive design techniques in order to fit the display actually to that screen, because the screen sizes are inconsistent. So when it comes to building these pages, it seems like there's a lot of work and testing, of course, is a big problem. So we know what the problem looks like on mobile. So PPK wrote this great article for A List Apart talking about the smartphone browser landscape, and in it, he talked about testing. And the comments on this post are awesome because people are like, testing on as many devices as possible is great in theory, but in practice, it's untenable. And if this is the mobile landscape, I want no part of it, right? And I've got to say, if you think that's a problem, you ain't seen nothing yet, right? Like at least with mobile phones, the prices are lower. You're not spending several $1,000s on a television, and then you can stick all the phones in a drawer, right? Like where are you putting those smart TVs that you're going to test on? Our office is pretty small in Portland. I don't know what we're going to do with it. And also with mobile phones, you've got the carrier stores where you can go and you can test stuff at the carrier stores. But what I found in going and looking at these TVs was that most of the stores didn't have TVs on Wi-Fi. So like half of the TVs at Best Buy were smart TVs. There weren't remotes for any of them. They had 3 TVs with remotes. Or no, actually, I take that back. There were 3 TVs on Wi-Fi. One of them had a remote. They didn't know where the remote had gone for the other 2 TVs. Fry's was a little better. It had TVs everywhere, but none of them were on Wi-Fi. So of course I brought in my phone and tethered to all their TVs, which made for some interesting conversations with people. And of course, because these TVs haven't been on the network, they were really thirsty. So I got to pay for all those TVs occasionally to get software firmware updates, which not only sucks because it was on my data plan, but also delayed my testing while they updated themselves. Finally, I found a video store, or a place called Video Only in Portland that had all their TVs on Wi-Fi, and I asked them when I could come in that wouldn't disrupt them, and I brought in donuts for their salespeople, and I spent 4 or 5 hours testing on their televisions. All this makes me wonder, right? Like, if nobody's actually using these TVs, I mean, what are people actually expecting when they buy a smart TV? If they can't actually test them, if they can't actually use Netflix before they get that TV home, and they weren't asking for Netflix. I heard people weren't asking for smart TVs, but they did say, hey, I'd like to watch Netflix. Like, what TV supports watching Netflix? They don't know what they're getting. They've never tested it. Not only that, but I was on this LG TV, and at one point I ended up in the apps menu, and I noticed that it listed 300 or 30 megs out of the 300 some odd megs that were available on that device. And I thought, wow, I didn't think about it, but of course these devices have storage. And none of the stores, not a single one, listed the storage capacity of any single TV. So is there really a smart TV market? Now, I know people ask this question about tablets, and they say, hey, there's just an iPad market. But I think that that's a little false at this point, because we know that the Kindle Fire sold quite a bit. But when it comes to TVs, I think it's fair to ask, because I don't think that anyone who buys a smart TV, with rare exceptions, actually knows what they're getting when they buy that TV. So, it becomes really difficult to test on these. Some of the best ways to do it is the same way that we do when it comes to mobile, which is using emulators. Opera has a TV emulator that's really good. It actually connects to Dragonfly, so you can do remote debugging on it. Google TV has an emulator. And even if you don't do this, even if you're not going to build anything for TVs, I would recommend spending some time in the Google TV Spotlight. You can use it in Chrome in full screen, and you can see how these web pages have been designed to interact on television. And it's really neat. It's really cool to see how they're done. And again, you can use that same sort of stuff from the jQuery library to, up and down arrows to get around it. So what are the lessons that we can take away from televisions? The first one is that I think we spend too much time focusing on smaller screens. And this is something that I've felt for quite some time. Last year I was giving a talk, and I was quoting actually Scott again about the fact that at South by Southwest he was talking about how phones are useful with the screen off. There's no reason why we can't have it vibrate once when we need to turn left when we're walking down the street, and vibrate twice if we need to turn right. And so the fact that we look at mobile as a smaller screen version of desktop is actually problematic, because there's so much more that mobile phones can do. And when we start looking at TV resolution, and we realize that that resolution is exactly the same as desktop resolution, we start to realize that just thinking about screen resolution as an indicator of what UI should be is really problematic. We also need to start thinking about multiple screens and how we're going to participate in that ecosystem, how we can build stuff. I think it also makes us question a little bit about context. So is it really true that there's no context there, but then when we get to televisions, suddenly there is context? I don't know. Or is TV context different because we're still in that feature phone era of the smart TV? I think that those are open questions to answer. One of the things that I'm looking at and sort of watching is how Netflix is addressing this stuff. So Netflix is, in the same way in which a lot of us are looking at NPR and looking at how NPR is handling content on sort of the wide diversity of devices, NPR has been ahead of us when it comes to looking at television, all these different systems, and delivering their content across all these devices. And NPR looks at posture as defining these different experiences. Netflix. Netflix talks about the fact that there are people internally who have argued for a single experience across all devices, but it's never been borne out in any of their user testing. And so consequently, they've got different experiences across different devices. And what they look at is they look at a combination of these things. They look at user posture, stationary versus lean back or on the go, shared, whether it's input capabilities, pointer, keyboard, left, right, up, down, navigation style, display capabilities, high res, far away, medium. And they talk about the fact that they feel that these constraints are really powerful and that you need to embrace them to create appropriate designs. And thanks to Luke Grabluski for his notes on this. This is really fantastic stuff. So the question that I end up having is if this is actually the case, when we need more control in order to build a better experience for these televisions, how can we do so in a maintainable way? And I don't think we've got really good answers for that at the moment. So here's the deal. Yes, smart TVs suck right now, and I'm not telling you that you should go home and build stuff for smart TVs, but I think that it would be dangerous for us to ignore them at this moment in time. First, it would be dangerous for us to think that they're not going to, at some point, be useful and be used in this way. Back in 1996, there was this article published in the New York Times about how the internet has been overhyped because AOL and CompuServe don't have users. People haven't been using those systems. So really, the internet is never going to take off. The web is really never going to take off. Back in fall of 2007, October of 2007, after the iPhone came out, there was an article in the New York Times talking about how mobile web was never going to take off. That we know over the last decade there have been browsers on these phones and people don't want to use them. People don't want to use the web on their phones. That's crazy talk. The iPhone, yeah, it's great, but nobody's really going to use the web on their phones. All of which just goes to like this fundamental truth that we can't predict future behavior from a current experience that sucks, right? Like you can't predict how many people are going to access your phone on a mobile device if your desktop website sucks, right? You can't look at your analytics and make that determination. We cannot look at smart TVs right now and say, hey, nobody wants to use the browser on their smart TV. Nobody wants a computer on their television. I think that that's actually incorrect. I think that when it's a usable interface, that people will, in fact, use these devices. So even if we don't need to design for TVs today, it behooves us to start thinking about and planning for what it will be like to do so. So we won't build these solutions for today's problems, the phones and tablets and things like that, and then find ourselves surprised by what comes next. And all of this is sort of the stuff that we've been thinking about as we talk about future-friendly, as we try to build solutions both in our own private practice and as web professionals generally, solutions that will stand the test of time, that won't end up like media types. Like, how do we build these sorts of things? How do we take into consideration where we're going? And I don't have all the answers, but I would love for you to help me and to continue to talk about that stuff. And thank you all very, very much.
We actually have time for a question or two.
Oh, wow. How did that happen? In rehearsing this, I was like 15 minutes over every single time. So, all right, there's a question over there.
Can you say something about the updates of the browsers? So can we see in the future that support for CSS queries will increase?
So updates of browsers. So I would say that predominantly, well, first off, all the TVs that I looked at were using either WebKit or were using Opera. And so their standard support was really good. The problem is that with the exception of Google TV, I feel like they're very much like feature phones. The televisions aren't getting updated with firmware updates that update the browser. So we need to move, that's part of the reason why I feel like we need to move past sort of the feature phone era of televisions and move into the next era, because the software updates for these really don't address that sort of stuff. What happens is the 2012 models are much better than the 2011 models, and the 2013 models will be much better than the 2012 models, and so that's sort of the cycle that we're on. And if you bought a TV and you've got it for 5 years, the browser is going to be the same as it was when you bought it. Now, my hope is that when we move to Google TV, or if Apple releases a TV, there will be pressure on these other TV manufacturers to start updating stuff. And Google has actually updated Chrome on Google TV. So I've seen that happen. Do I have time for one more? One more? Anyone else? There's another one over there.
So just a quick question about the Netflix and the Guardian app. Do you know how they detect whether you're on the TV or not? Is it a different URL or?
So with the applications that have been built for Google TV, or Google's own recommendation is to use the user agent string to detect Google TV. And Google TV's user agent string is actually really good. And to be honest, I picked on an example of a TV that was really bad from a user agent string perspective. Most of the TVs that I looked at had something distinguishable in it that you could use to detect. That just happened to be one where I basically threw up my hands in the store and had a bunch of salespeople look at me funny. They were already doing that, but when you exclaim loudly and just turn around and take a little walk, they know that something's wrong. So yeah, most of the time it's user agent string. Yeah.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you all.